Hey guys, so what is the first thing that you do when you get a brand new PC game? If you're anything like me, the first thing that I like to do is jump right into the graphics settings and fine-tune these settings to balance graphics and performance. In this video, you're going to find out what these things mean. Tessellation, anti-aliasing, ambient occlusion. It's a headache. So all of this graphics jargon that you've wondered about for years, you will finally understand what these things mean. And I'm going to be using GeForce Experience on my Razer Blade 2020. Let's go ahead and find out what these things mean. Oh, I forgot. Let me put on my geeky glasses, man, so I can sound and look smarter. You're going to have lots of jargon in this video, so prepare to get bored. Alright guys, so let's get down to basics. The first thing that you need to know is what is a pixel and what is resolution? As most of you know, a pixel is a tiny little dot of color. That dot adds up in rows and columns, and when you multiply them together, you get resolution. Most of you know what HD means, which is 1920 by 1080. That is HD resolution. Then comes, for example, 4K, 3840 by 2160. So resolution is important in gaming, but most of you don't know why. The higher the resolution, the better, the better quality graphics, right? Everybody knows that. Yeah. No, but that's not it. Seriously. The reason why resolution is important is because if you have a higher resolution setting, you can actually have it easier on your anti-aliasing. You may no longer need that much anti-aliasing. And I'm going to get to anti-aliasing later. So keep that in mind. The next thing we got to talk about is FPS, or frames per second. And don't confuse FPS with refresh rate, a monitor's refresh rate, for example, which is how many times a monitor refreshes itself per second. FPS simply means the number of images generated per second. Now, since refresh rate is the number of times your display refreshes itself per second, it's measured in hertz. Hertz. Man, that sounds like my physics class right now. By the way, engineering was fun, for the most part. 1 hertz is 1 cycle per second, so it's easy to compare. So that means if you have a 60 hertz monitor, it updates 60 times per second. Most monitors are standard 60 hertz, but you've got some of these brand new monitors, for example, this one. This beast right here is 300 hertz, ultra fast refresh rate. And now, of course, you've got higher refresh rates. The Alienware has 360 hertz. All right, guys, without further ado, let's fire up GeForce Experience and start learning these graphics acronyms. I don't know why. Alright guys, so now let's have a look at the different graphics settings for Deus Ex, Mankind Divided, and let's learn together about the different graphics terms or the graphics jargon that you can see in most of these games. Let's start with Ambient Occlusion. Ambient Occlusion darkens the creases and corners in the scene in order to add depth. You can see that over here, right next to the word, what's that, Kasna, Kapkova, Kasna, that adds a little bit of depth. It darkens the creases and the corners in the scene and adds depth. And you have different types of ambient occlusion, and if you want more details on that, I'm going to leave a link in the description below on all the different types of ambient occlusion. Up next is cloth physics. You can see here that cloth physics enables more realistic cloth movement. So for example, you can see that this person's jacket starts moving around, and that gives you the impression or the illusion of a more realistic cloth movement. Contact hardening shadows. Contact hardening shadows creates a more realistic shadow fall off, resulting in softer shadows edges for shadows that are further away from the source. So that creates a more realistic shadow fall off, and that's called contact hardening shadows. Up next, depth of field. Depth of field is a cinematic effect that only focuses on the characters speaking during dialogue and keeps everything else slightly out of focus. Just like when you have depth of field in a camera lens, it's the same thing here. It gives you that cinematic effect, and it focuses on the characters speaking right in front of you, and everything else is out of focus. Lens flares. Lens flares add a camera-like flare of light when looking at the sun and other extremely bright light sources. You can see in this shot there's some sort of flare when you're looking at the blinking strobes, the police cars blinking strobes. You have flare, and that gives you the impression that this is extremely bright. It's an extremely bright light source. Level of detail adjusts the detail level and visibility of objects, surfaces, and other game elements. Of course, the higher the level of detail, the more taxing it is on your system and on your hardware. MSAA, high quality, high cost, multi-sample anti-aliasing that smoothens the appearance of jagged edges in the game. Now, anti-aliasing in general, what is anti-aliasing? Anti-aliasing is the concept of smoothing these jagged edges that look like staircases. You know, if you zoom right in, you're going to see that if you have any curves, especially with older games, you can see that they're pixelated. No, not pixelated. They're more like polygons. They're polygonated, if that's a word. So anti-aliasing smooths that appearance of jagged edges. It takes care of all the jaggy stuff. Up next is Parallax Occlusion Mapping. Parallax Occlusion Mapping creates the appearance of extra detail on surfaces, typically where tessellation would be too performance intensive to implement. We're going to get to tessellation pretty soon, but the word parallax in and of itself means the effect whereby the position or direction of an object appears to differ when viewed from different positions. So that's what parallax means. And parallax occlusion mapping gives you the appearance of extra detail without having to use tessellation, which is too performance intensive to implement in this case. So if you look at the ground, that gives you the illusion of extra detail without having to use more resources. And that's what parallax occlusion is, because when you're looking at it from different positions, it gives you that realistic look. Up next, of course, is resolution. We already talked about that. In this case, this is 1920 by 1080. Screen space reflections adjusts the quality of real-time reflections found on innumerable surfaces throughout the game. It improves the quality of these reflections throughout the game. Shadow quality adjusts the fidelity of the game's shadows and adds extra detail as the setting is raised. You can see here that the shadow quality is improved. So the lower the shadow quality, the better the performance. The higher the shadow quality, the lower the performance. If you look at this lady's face, subsurface scattering increases the quality of lighting and shading on the character's skin, most noticeably during cutscenes. And that gives you a more realistic look. And that's what subsurface scattering refers to. Let's move on to temporal anti-aliasing. Temporal anti-aliasing enables the temporal anti-aliasing, which reduces the shimmering and flickering of anti-aliased edges. So when you have anti-aliasing, that smooths the edges and it kind of blends the pixels around it to give you the illusion of a more smooth surface. And temporal anti-aliasing reduces that kind of shimmering and flickering of these anti-aliased edges. Tessellation. Tessellation adds extra geometric detail to select surfaces in the game world, making them look less angular and more realistic. So that means you're going to have a more realistic look because you're adding more geometric details to the surface. Texture filtering improves the sharpness of textures, especially those viewed at a distance or on a low viewing angle. And for this, for example, I've set it to 16x anisotropic, which is the highest. The higher you set this thing, the more your performance is going to suffer. We're going to get to what anisotropic means in a bit. Texture quality controls the quality and fidelity of the textures applied to every character, object, and terrain element in the game. So the higher the texture quality, again, the higher the texture quality, the more your performance is going to suffer. Volumetric lighting, we talked about that. It improves the quality of lighting in fog or smoke. Alright guys, so now we had a look at Deus Ex's different graphics settings. Let's have a look at Battlefield 4 and let's learn more about these graphics settings. Okay, Ambient Occlusion, we talked about this already, which adds soft shadows to crevices and objects that are in close proximity to one another. You can see the gun's barrel here. It looks more realistic because of the shadows that were added to this barrel. Anti-aliasing deferred. Multi-sample anti-aliasing that removes jagged edges from character models, weapons, buildings, and many other objects and game elements. So we talked about anti-aliasing. Effects quality. Adjust the visual fidelity of particle-based effects like smoke, tracers, and explosions. That is called effects quality. Up next is lighting quality, and that adjusts the complexity and fidelity of dynamic shadows. Lighting quality. Oh, let me have a look at this. Look at that. I don't know what that is. Oh, that is the shadow of that thing that is falling. What is that, a silo? I think that's a silo. So the lighting quality, the higher it is, the better the shadow of the object. Mesh quality. Mesh quality adjusts the level of detail of trees, rocks, buildings, and other objects. You can see here this tree's bark. If you increase the mesh quality, you can have more level of detail for the trees and the rocks and the buildings, whatever. Post-process quality adjusts the quality of post-process effects like high dynamic range lighting, bloom, and God rays. So that's called post-process quality. Let's move on to modern warfare. Let's see what we got here. Okay, once again, ambient occlusion. So ambient occlusion is pretty important. You can see this image right here. This guy's holding something, and you can see the shadow right here. That is ambient occlusion, so that adds the soft shadows to the crevices and objects in close proximity to one another, and that improves the image quality. Anti-aliasing, like we said, removes the jagged edges from game elements, improves the image quality, and there are different types of anti-aliasing. I'm going to leave a link in the description below. You can have a look at the different types. Bullet impacts and sprays. That's nice. So shows bullet impacts on surfaces. Depth of field, like we said, controls the depth of field, focuses only on the subject area of the screen, whatever's in front of you, and blurs everything out for visual effect. Particle lighting. Particle lighting adjusts the quality of lighting for particle-based effects. Particle quality adjusts the density of particle effects such as smoke plumes. That gives you more quality. Render resolution. Downscales or upscales games graphics. Downsampling offers crisper image at the expense of performance. Upsampling reduces the internal rendering resolution but improves performance. So that is what you need to know about render resolution. Screen space reflection, SSR, adds real-time reflections to bodies of water and shiny reflective surfaces. By the way, we're not even talking about ray tracing or DLSS in this video. I'm going to have to make a separate video about DLSS and ray tracing, so stay tuned for that. Shadow map resolution. Let's see, shadow map resolution adjusts the fidelity and sharpness of the shadow. So you can see this shadow right here, and it becomes sharper. I see this a lot in games. The shadows are not sharp. They're kind of low quality sometimes. So shadow map resolution adjusts the fidelity and sharpness of shadows. Tessellation adds extra geometric detail, like we said, primarily to ground surfaces, but also to select objects, increasing image quality and realism. That's what tessellation does, makes it look more realistic by adding more geometric details. Texture filter and isotropic. Now, texture filter and isotropic improves the sharpness of textures, especially those viewed from a distance or at an angle. And the word anisotropic refers to having a physical property that has a different value when measured in different directions. Texture resolution increases the resolution of textures used on surfaces and objects. Alright, so now that we've finished Modern Warfare, let's have a look at Just Cause. And let's see if we've missed anything. Anisotropic level improves the sharpness of textures, especially those viewed from a distance or at an angle. You can see here the quality is better. Oh, there's Rico. Of course, all hell is breaking loose over here. Shadow quality adjusts the detail level, quality, or visibility of shadows. Sometimes different games call these settings different things. So shadow quality, in this game they call it shadow quality. In the previous game it was called, if you remember here, we talked about this, it was called, what was it? Shadow map resolution. Adjusts the fidelity and sharpness of shadows. So different games sometimes call these things different things. But some of them remain constant, like anti-aliasing or ambient occlusion, stuff like that. Ocean tessellation is a type of tessellation that adds genuine geometric detail to water surfaces, further improving their level of detail. You can see here this body of water looks more realistic thanks to ocean tessellation. Screen space reflections add real-time reflections to surfaces, objects, vehicles, and water throughout the game, greatly improving image quality. Shadow quality is straightforward, adds the detail level that we said. SSAO adds soft shadows to crevices and objects that are in close proximity to one another, dramatically improving image quality. Texture quality adjusts the fidelity and sharpness of textures applied to all game elements. And water detail adjusts the detail level and realism of water, adding crest foam, wave detail, and other enhancements as this setting is raised. So that's about it, guys. I hope you enjoyed this video. It may have been a little bit technical. Actually, it's been really technical. Lots of graphics jargon. But I thought the best way to learn about graphics together, as I'm learning with you, is to go through the GeForce experience and having a look at the different elements here like we just did. That way you can learn more about these graphics settings. And I forgot to mention something. When you fire up GeForce Experience and you select the game that you want to play, for example, Deus Ex, if you click on Optimize, now it's already optimized. If I click Revert, just to show you, the settings would go back to the original settings. If I click on Optimize, NVIDIA will automatically choose the optimal settings for your machine based on your machine's capabilities and specs.